A week ago, Kyle and I got married surrounded by our loved ones. The day was everything we dreamed of, filled with laughter, warm embraces, and the joy of sharing it with the people who mean the most to us. The wedding went off without a hitch, almost. The only blip in our otherwise perfect day was my stepmother Gigi trying to derail everything. My parents divorced when I was a child, but they managed to co-parent seamlessly, making sure I always felt loved and supported. Over time, both found happiness in new relationships. My mom is now dating a man named Holt, and my dad married Gigi, who brought her daughter Naomi into our family. Naomi is a year older than me, and at first I thought we might become friends. But that hope quickly vanished. When Dad wasn't around, Naomi showed her true colors. She'd mock my clothes, make fun of my hair, and if I clapped back, she'd make a scene, even crying to make it look like I'd hit her. Gigi would come running, always taking Naomi's side without question, no matter how much I tried to explain what really happened. My dad never picked sides, just sighed in disappointment when he heard we'd been fighting. As the years passed, Mom noticed how Gigi and Naomi treated me when Dad wasn't home. She had a word with him about it. And after that, Dad started taking me on special weekend outings, just the two of us. Those moments were a sanctuary for me, a time where I could talk freely and feel cherished. When Gigi learned about our outings, she wasn't happy. She insisted that Dad include Naomi, but he refused, saying our father-daughter time was important. Kyle and I had been together for 6 years before our wedding. Throughout that time, he got to know my family well. During one family dinner, Gigi blurted out, "Kyle's way too handsome for you." The room fell silent, my mom glaring at her in disbelief. Gigi tried to play it off as a joke, but Kyle wasn't having it. He defended me right then and there, saying he was lucky to have me. His words warmed my heart, but Gigi's comment stayed with me, gnawing at my self-esteem. Kyle is 6'2", fit and objectively attractive. At 5'5" and curvier, I'd sometimes felt insecure, though Kyle never gave me a reason to be. He loved me exactly as I was, always making me feel cherished. But Gigi's offhanded compliments and Naomi's behavior only chipped away at my confidence over time. Naomi had her own way of making me feel uneasy. She flirted with Kyle, making him uncomfortable despite his repeated efforts to set boundaries. One Thanksgiving, during a game of truth or dare, she was dared to sit on the person she liked the most. Instead of choosing her mom, she pointed to Kyle. He immediately stood up, rejecting her with a look that spoke volumes. Naomi's face turned beet red, and I couldn't help but laugh at her failed attempt to make him notice her. The tension only grew as our wedding day approached. Dad convinced me to invite Gigi and Naomi, promising to throw them out at the first sign of trouble. Reluctantly, I agreed. I wanted the day to go smoothly, but deep down, I feared what might happen. The morning of the wedding was everything I imagined. My dress fit perfectly, my hair was styled just right, and my bridesmaids were ready to help me down the aisle. But of course, Gigi had to make her move. She stormed into the dressing room, insisting we talk privately. My mom told her to leave, but Gigi pushed, saying it was urgent. Sighing, I asked everyone to give us a minute. "Make it quick, Gigi," I warned. She smirked and laid out photos on the table, claiming they'd change everything I knew about Kyle. I stared at the photos scattered across the table, my heartbeat thundering in my chest. They showed Kyle at a restaurant, sitting across from a woman I didn't recognize at first glance. Gigi's eyes sparkled with malicious glee as she leaned in, whispering as if she were doing me a favor. "I thought you should see these before making the biggest mistake of your life," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. I forced myself to take a deep breath, refusing to let her panic me. I looked at her, taking in the smug expression she wore, thinking she'd just won. Determined not to let her control the narrative, I opened the door and called for my mother, asking her to bring Kyle and my dad into the room. Gigi's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, assuming I was about to confront Kyle in front of everyone. Kyle walked in hesitantly, careful not to see my wedding dress, but at this point I didn't care about traditions. He glanced around the room, confused by the tense atmosphere. My dad followed, looking from me to Gigi with a furrowed brow. "Kyle," I began calmly, gesturing to the photos on the table. "Can you explain these?" He looked at them, his face shifting from confusion to recognition and then a smirk. Gigi's victorious expression began to crack as he chuckled softly, picking up the photos and shaking his head. This is my cousin, Elena, Kyle said, glancing at me with a reassuring smile. We had dinner last week to catch up because she was passing through town. You met her at that family reunion last summer, remember? I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. I did remember Elena now, tall with dark hair and an infectious laugh. Gigi's face went pale as she realized her plan was unraveling right in front of her. My dad's eyes narrowed as he caught on to what had happened. Gigi, he said, his tone ice cold. You were the one who brought these pictures to her, right? I nodded, explaining how she had interrupted my wedding preparations to spread lies about Kyle. My dad's face darkened with a mix of anger and disappointment as he turned to Gigi. She tried to recover, stuttering about only wanting what was best for me. Why, Gigi? He demanded. Why would you do something like this on her wedding day? Gigi's mask of concern slipped, replaced by a bitter scowl. Because she doesn't deserve him, she shouted. Naomi has loved Kyle for years. It's her who should be with him, not her, she spat, nodding in my direction. The room fell into stunned silence. My mother, who had been standing near the doorway, stepped forward, disbelief and anger etched into her features. You're insane, she said quietly, her voice low but sharp. Naomi burst into the room then, sensing the tension and feeding off it. What's going on? She demanded, her eyes darting around. My dad turned to her, his voice tight. Naomi, your mother just admitted she tried to sabotage this wedding for you. Naomi's eyes flared with rage, and she turned on me like a cornered animal. This is all your fault, she screamed. You've ruined everything. You don't deserve him, and you never will. I stood my ground, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. Naomi, this isn't about who deserves who. Kyle and I are in love. Your mother tried to tear us apart with lies, and it didn't work. This has to stop. Kyle stepped forward then, his jaw clenched. Naomi, I've made it clear many times that I'm not interested. What you and your mom did today crossed every line. This is our wedding day, and you had no right. The room fell silent again, and for a moment I saw something flicker across Naomi's face. Hurt, maybe, or realization. But it passed quickly, replaced by anger. My dad sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He turned to Gigi, who looked defiant and unapologetic. I want both of you to leave, he said firmly. You're not welcome here after this. Gigi opened her mouth to protest, but my mom stepped forward, cutting her off. No, you've done enough damage. Leave. Naomi shot me a glare full of venom as she grabbed Gigi's arm and stormed out, muttering curses under her breath. The room felt lighter once they were gone, but the weight of what had just happened still pressed down on us. Kyle reached out, gently squeezing my hand, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. Are you okay? He whispered. I nodded, feeling the relief wash over me. Yeah, I said, managing a small smile. I am now. The moment Gigi and Naomi stormed out, a silence hung in the room, thick with the weight of everything that had just unraveled. My dad looked exhausted, as if the years of tension with Gigi had just caught up with him all at once. He let out a deep sigh, turning to me with regret in his eyes. I quote, "I'm sorry, kiddo," he said, his voice rough. I should have seen this coming. I shook my head, squeezing his arm reassuringly. It's not your fault, Dad. They made their own choices. Kyle, standing beside me, squeezed my hand again. His touch anchored me, a reminder that despite the chaos, he was by my side, unwavering. My mother stepped up next, her eyes darting between us. All right, she said, clapping her hands as if to break the spell of the last few minutes. We're not letting this ruin today. It's your wedding day, sweetheart, and you deserve all the happiness. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat as the reality sank back in. This was still our day, and I wasn't going to let anyone steal that from us. My bridesmaids, who had been watching with wide eyes, started moving again, fixing my veil and adjusting my dress. The room shifted back into a flurry of last-minute preparations, but my mind was racing. The ceremony started soon after, and as I walked down the aisle with my dad at my side, the chaos faded. Kyle stood at the end, eyes locked on mine, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. The vows we exchanged felt even more profound, knowing what we'd just faced together. Our love had been tested and had come out stronger. After the ceremony, the celebration kicked into full gear. Laughter filled the air as we danced, ate, and toasted to our new beginning. But I could see the strain in my dad's smile, the weight of Gigi's actions lingering at the edge of his joy. During a quiet moment, I pulled him aside. Dad, are you okay? I asked, searching his face for signs of how he was holding up. He hesitated before answering, eyes clouded. I will be. Today is about you, though. Let's focus on that. I nodded, but it was hard to ignore the knot of worry in my chest. The man who'd always been my rock was dealing with the fallout of his wife's betrayal. And while Gigi was now out of our wedding, the aftermath of her actions wasn't going to disappear overnight. As the night went on, Kyle and I danced until our feet ached, surrounded by the warmth of friends and family who had no idea of the drama that had nearly upended the day. It felt good to lose ourselves in the moment, even just for a while. The day after the wedding, Kyle and I woke up in a haze of exhaustion and happiness. We were officially married, and despite everything, it felt perfect. But my phone buzzed nonstop with missed calls and messages. My dad had called, then my mom, and even some of my cousins. My heart sank, knowing it had to do with Gigi and Naomi. Kyle sat up beside me, running a hand through his messy hair. "What's going on?" he asked, noticing my expression. "Not sure, but I'm guessing the aftermath has started," I muttered, showing him the notifications. We decided to call my dad back first. His voice was tired and strained as he explained that Gigi had been ranting about the wedding to anyone who would listen, twisting the story to make herself the victim. Naomi, true to form, was adding fuel to the fire, accusing me of ruining her life and tearing their family apart. I could hear the frustration in my dad's voice as he recounted the chaos they were causing. "Listen," he said finally. "I just wanted you to know what's going on. Don't let it ruin your honeymoon, okay? You and Kyle deserve this time." I thanked him, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. After we hung up, Kyle pulled me close, pressing a kiss to my temple. "We quote, deal with them when we get back," he said. His voice was steady, reassuring. "Right now, this is our time. He was right, but it didn't make it easier. The thought of going back to a storm of accusations and drama left a sour taste in my mouth. But I pushed it aside. For now, I needed to focus on the man beside me and the life we were starting together. The days that followed were filled with moments I'll never forget. Strolling through sunlit streets, sharing quiet dinners, laughing over nothing, it was the perfect start to our marriage. But in the back of my mind, I knew the peace wouldn't last forever, and it didn't. A few days into our honeymoon, I got a call from my dad. His voice was heavy as he told me that Gigi and Naomi had escalated things further. Naomi was now spreading rumors, telling anyone who would listen that Kyle had led her on, and I had manipulated him into staying with me. The absurdity of it made me laugh bitterly. When I told Kyle, his jaw clenched in frustration. "They're desperate," he said, eyes darkening. "But we're not letting them win." Agreed, I said. But deep down, I knew that facing them when we got home would be another battle entirely. Returning from our honeymoon felt bittersweet. The vacation had been everything we needed, a temporary escape from the chaos. But as we stepped back into our home, reality settled in like an unwelcome guest. My phone pinged non-stop with messages and missed calls, each one a reminder of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. The first night back, I called my dad to check in. His voice was calm but tired, and he confirmed what I'd suspected. Gigi and Naomi hadn't let up. They were spreading stories to friends and family, painting themselves as victims of my vindictive behavior, and casting Kyle as some clueless man caught in my trap. It was absurd, but it stung. I quote, "Sorry you're dealing with this," I said softly. "It's not fair to you," Dad sighed. "It's not your fault, kiddo. I just wish they'd stop trying to drag everyone into their drama." Kyle listened as I recounted the call, his expression darkening. "We need to confront them," he said. "This has gone too far." The next day, I decided it was time to face them. I called Gigi and Naomi and arranged to meet at a cafe. Kyle wanted to come, but I insisted I needed to do this on my own. When I arrived, they were already there. Gigi sat with her arms crossed, a look of defiance on her face, while Naomi fidgeted, eyes darting around nervously. I sat down, the silence between us heavy. "I'm here to put an end to this," I started, keeping my voice calm but firm. Your behavior during my wedding was unacceptable, and it's not going to continue, Gigi scoffed. Unacceptable? I was trying to save you from a mistake. You should be thanking me. I felt a flash of anger but pushed it down. What you did wasn't saving anyone. It was sabotage, plain and simple. And now, you're spreading lies to make yourselves look like the victims. Naomi leaned forward, her voice sharp. We're not lying. Everyone knows Kyle deserves better, and deep down you know it too. I stared at her, astonished by the audacity. Naomi, Kyle, and I are married. We love each other, and nothing you or your mother says will change that. This obsession with him has to stop. Gigi bristled, eyes narrowing. Obsession? My daughter is simply better suited for him, and you know it. You've always been jealous of her. I laughed, the absurdity of the statement breaking through my frustration. Jealous? Of what? The lies, the games, the desperation? No. I have a husband who loves me and supports me. That's something neither of you can take away, no matter how hard you try. The conversation escalated, voices rising. Gigi's calm facade shattered as she hurled accusations, her words biting. Naomi, fueled by her mother's anger, jumped in, accusing me of manipulating Kyle and stealing the life she thought she deserved. The bitterness in her words was palpable, and I realized then just how deep their delusions ran. Finally, I stood up, my voice clear and strong. I came here hoping we could find some common ground, some way to move forward without this constant conflict. But it's clear that's not possible. If you can't respect me or my marriage, then we're done. Gigi's face turned red, her mouth opening and closing as she grasped for a retort. But I was already walking away, leaving them at the table, the weight of their toxic energy lifting with each step. When I got home, Kyle was waiting, his eyes full of questions. How did it go? He asked. I took a deep breath, letting the tension seep out of my body. Exactly how I thought it would. They're not willing to change. He pulled me into a hug, and I felt the warmth of his embrace wash over me, grounding me. Then we move forward without them, he said, his voice steady. A few days later, the fallout began. Gigi and Naomi's antics had reached other family members, and the truth of what happened at the wedding had spread. Relatives who had been swayed by their stories started calling, asking for the real version. My cousin Fiona, one of my bridesmaids, had overheard Gigi's outburst on the wedding day and wasn't shy about sharing what she knew. The tide turned, and soon, Gigi and Naomi found themselves facing the same judgment they'd tried to cast on me. My dad called one evening, sounding relieved. People are finally seeing through their nonsense, he said. It's about time. But even with the family support, Gigi and Naomi weren't done. Naomi started sending me messages, each one more unhinged than the last. She accused me of tearing her family apart and of being selfish and cruel. At first I ignored them, but as they continued, the strain began to wear on me. Kyle noticed the change in me and sat me down. This ends now, he said, determination in his eyes. We're blocking them, cutting off the drama for good. He was right. It was time to put our peace first. Together, we blocked their numbers and social media, drawing a line in the sand. It felt like a weight lifting, a choice to choose our happiness over their chaos. Blocking Gigi and Naomi felt like reclaiming a piece of my sanity. The days that followed were quiet, almost surreal in their stillness. Kyle and I settled into our life as newlyweds, finding comfort in the simple moments, making breakfast together, sharing late-night talks, and planning for the future. But the peace wasn't entirely without shadows. My dad called often, updating me on the fallout from Gigi's increasingly erratic behavior. It's getting worse, he admitted one night. Gigi's telling anyone who will listen that we've all turned against her unfairly. Naomi's backing her up, saying you've poisoned me against them. I sighed, the exhaustion creeping back in. What do you think, Dad? Do you really believe that? There was a pause on the line before he answered, his voice steady. No, sweetheart. I see them for who they are now. It's just hard to accept that this is what it's come to. No one wants to believe that the people they care about are capable of such toxicity. But the truth had a way of surfacing, and now that it had, there was no going back. Weeks turned into months, and in that time, my dad made a decision that surprised no one. He and Gigi separated, the strain of her actions finally breaking their already fragile marriage. He moved out and began consulting with lawyers, preparing for divorce. When Gigi realized he was serious, she tried to reach out to me, but I kept her blocked. The silence between us spoke louder than any argument ever could. One day, Kyle and I were sitting on the couch, a movie playing in the background, when his phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. "It's Gigi," he said, showing me a long, rambling message she had somehow managed to send from a new number. "She's blaming me for the divorce, saying I turned Dad against her and that Naomi's heartbroken," I muttered as we read it together. I felt a twinge of guilt, but Kyle's arm around my shoulders reminded me that I hadn't caused this. Gigi and Naomi's choices had. Kyle blocked the number without hesitation, a silent declaration that we were moving on. The days that followed were full of small victories. My dad started to look healthier and lighter as he found his way out of the chaos. He spent more time with Kyle and me, even joining us for dinner where we'd laugh about old stories and plan new adventures. Seeing him slowly reclaim his joy was the closure I needed. A month later, my mom and I took a beach vacation. She'd been worried about me since the wedding, and it felt good to have her near, talking about everything and nothing as we walked along the shoreline. The rhythmic sound of the waves and the warmth of the sand beneath our feet made everything else fade away. It was a healing I didn't know I needed. "It's amazing how peace feels, isn't it?" she said, squeezing my hand as we watched the sun dip below the horizon. I nodded, my heart full. In those quiet moments, I realized I was done looking back. The anger, the hurt. It all seemed so far away. Kyle and I were building a life full of laughter, support, and love, and that was more than enough. Back home, things continued to improve. Dad's divorce proceedings moved forward, and he blocked all contact from Gigi and Naomi. Without their relentless presence, a calm settled over him, and he started picking up old hobbies, gardening, playing the guitar he'd set aside for years. It was like watching him come back to life, piece by piece. Kyle and I fell into a comfortable rhythm. We'd spend our evenings cooking dinner together, sharing stories about our day and planning little weekend trips. The nightmare Gigi and Naomi had tried to create felt like a distant memory, a storm we'd weathered and left behind. I couldn't help but feel grateful for the way Kyle had stood by me through it all, unwavering and loyal. His love had been the one constant, the light that kept me steady even when everything around me threatened to fall apart. Every now and then I'd hear from family members about Gigi's latest attempt to gain sympathy or Naomi's continued bitterness, but their drama no longer reached me. They were echoes, powerless and fading. The love Kyle and I shared had proven stronger than their schemes, and that was all that mattered. As I sat on the porch one evening, sipping a cup of tea while Kyle strummed his guitar beside me, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. It reminded me of that beach sunset with my mom, of the promise of new beginnings. "Hey," Kyle said, breaking me out of my thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" I smiled, leaning my head on his shoulder. "Just how lucky I am, Dot." He chuckled, pressing a kiss to my temple. "Me too, Dot." And with that, the past felt even further away. We had a life to live, full of promise and free of the shadows that once tried to darken it. In that moment, I knew we were exactly where we were meant to be, together, stronger and happier than ever before. Spree 2. This tale is called "I Got a Better Job and I Let My Parents Take It Because They Demanded My Wages or Threatened to Throw Me Out." Karma also strikes harshly. Okay, let's get started. I recently completed my construction apprenticeship in February, and I am 21 years old. I'm finally getting compensated correctly after a lengthy journey to get here, $27.50 per hour. I feel like everything is now coming together for the first time. That jump from minimum pay to this is substantial, which is why I'm thrilled. It truly is a game changer. However, positive news travels quickly as usual. My parents were the first to learn about it. They appeared pleased for me at first, saying things like, "Oh, that's great, you've done so well," and so on. I hoped they would be truly pleased for me for once. Then suddenly they say, "Now that you're earning more money, it's time for you to start paying your rent." I understand now. As an adult, I contribute a small amount to the house. It makes sense. But let that sink in when they told me that I was making $350 a week. My younger brother and I share a single bedroom, which costs $350. For comparison, it is around the cost of a studio apartment in the city where I reside. I'm not even making this up. I don't even get my own room, and they're asking for more than other people pay for their entire stupid establishment. My brother, who happens to be at the age when he's just annoying to be around, needs to know. His belongings are all over the place. It's really loud. Up at strange hours, it lacks seclusion and is claustrophobic and disorganized. However, my folks are behaving as though they own a posh hotel or something. Naturally, I retreated a little. It still felt fair when I offered to give them $150 each week instead. I was already contributing to the family costs, and $150 covers a significant amount of change. Yes, exactly. Call. Online. That's electricity. It's not like I'm freeloading. I cover around a third of it each month. I even take care of a lot of extra household tasks that most people don't perform unless they are compensated. However, my parents refused to budge. They told me that was just the way things were going to be, and stuck to their $350 or nothing policy. The fact that it's not simply about the rent is what truly irritates me. I've essentially been the one they turn to for whatever they need for years. I need a driver. Every morning I take my younger brother and sister to school. I'm responsible for it. It makes no difference whether I have to take a half-hour detour to get to work. The family is me. Take a taxi. It's not even that, just throughout the week. On the weekends, I spend the most of my Saturdays driving my sister to her horse exhibitions. These exhibitions can sometimes be so far away that I have to take a Friday or Monday off in order to transport her there and back. Then there are the household repairs. Guess who's on call to fix anything that breaks? Yes, exactly. Me? It makes no difference whether it's fixing the roof, the gutters, or the windows. I am the handyman in residence. No one is hired by them. They simply think that I'll take care of it because, well, I've always done it that way. I have the necessary expertise. Therefore, I don't mind lending a hand. However, all of this work has been done for free. Not even a thank you, really. Here are several dollars. Occasionally, it's simply expected. To be honest, if they had simply been reasonable about the rent, I wouldn't dislike the whole helping out part as much. Given that my income has increased, I could imagine giving them anything but $350. That's crazy. All of my friends that I've spoken to have stated the same thing. They would never spend that much to live with a sibling. At first, they assumed I was kidding, but they were stunned when I showed them the arithmetic. In fact, I'm paying top dollar for a shared room in my own family's home. I sat them down and told them what I already do for them after they insisted on $350. I explained everything. The repairs, the countless drives, the expenses I helped pay for. I informed them that I wasn't only lounging about, I'm doing more than my share of the work, but they responded, "It's $350 or nothing," staring me in the eyes. Nothing but stone-facedness, no concession, no empathy, as if they were speaking to their son and this was some kind of commercial deal. It dawned on me then. They no longer considered me a member of the family. To them, I was only a source of revenue, a means of reducing their own costs and expenditures. They thought, hey, let's get a cut of that, rather than congratulating me on my newfound success. The goal was to extract as much as possible from me, and I was not at all comfortable with it. I thus made another attempt to reason with them. Look, $150 a week is reasonable, I said. You won't have to worry about paying someone to drive the kids or hiring someone to handle repairs, since I'll continue to do everything around the house. I reasoned that they may change their mind if I presented it as a bargain, as if there were real financial advantages. However, they weren't amenable to it. Neither the money I was saving them nor the job I was doing mattered to them. It was either move out or $350. I had just finished at that moment. Their priorities were evident from the fact that they were unable to even reach a compromise. I'm not sure if they believed I had no other alternatives or if they felt I was bluffing. However, I immediately made the decision that I would not allow them to use guilt to persuade me to stay. They could treat me like a renter if they so desired. I would start behaving like one and think about what I could do. It was amazing to see how quickly they assigned a value to everything. The years of free labor, the expenses I had assisted in paying, and the numerous errands I conducted were all hidden from them. They didn't even bother to conceal it. All they saw was a weekly payout. I understand that they may be having some financial difficulties, particularly in light of my dad's health problems, but I can't believe they're expecting me to pay $350 for a shared bedroom. That's going too far. To be honest, my anger increased as I gave it more attention. Simply put, they were taking advantage of me, and it just made me want to go even more quickly. They seem to have forgotten that I am their son, and not just some jerk who owes them money. They misrepresented the fact that I had been assisting them as a family duty, a method to profit off me. At that point, I made the decision that I would not stay to be drained by my own parents. It's okay if they want to charge me like a stranger. I would go somewhere else and be a stranger. Okay, so this is the point at which things become even more absurd. You see, the problem with the rent alone would have been terrible enough, but it became worse. I already had a long list of things to take care of for my family, and none of them was particularly simple. They seemed to view me as their go-to person for everything, their chauffeur, and their living handyman, without ever truly appreciating it. I used to drop off my younger brother and sister at school every morning. It makes no difference if it's pouring, whether I simply need a little break or if I'm rushing late. Without question, they expected me to drive them. And remember, the school is not literally right next door. I have to add an additional hour to my day simply for school runs, which is a half-hour diversion each way. 5 hours a week, that is. Not to mention the several occasions they had me wait or do errands. And that's only what happens throughout the week. Weekends? Yes, they also had plans for me. Guess who was assigned to drive my sister to horse shows? She loved them. Yes, me. Furthermore, it's not as if these horse exhibitions are imminent. Some of them were so far away that I would have to skip Monday or leave work early on Fridays. Occasionally, simply to make things function. I was giving up real job hours in addition to burning my weekends for this. Furthermore, nobody was expressing gratitude or offering to pay for the gasoline. No, they simply anticipated it. To be honest, I was beginning to feel like a part-time babysitter and an unpaid Uber driver. Not that I didn't try to discuss it with them. This whole thing was growing stale, as I had said several times. They dismissed me with remarks like, "We're a family. We support one another." Correct. Everybody else just sat back and took it all for granted, but yet I was always the one lending a hand. And driving was only one aspect of it. I was the first and only person they would call for maintenance around the house. Windows that leak. Would you mind taking a look at that? The gutters were blocked. When you get a moment, are you able to remove those? The roof needs to be repaired. Don't you know how to do that? They seem to view me as a free handyman. I'm not even making this up. Because they have me instead of paying someone, I can't recall the last time they summoned a real repairman for anything. Once, the plumbing beneath the sink burst, causing the kitchen to flood. When they called, I was in the middle of a task. They are in a panic and are urging me to come home and repair things. I drive over, struggle with plumbing for half the day, and eventually figure it out. You would think that I may receive gratitude or perhaps an offer to pay for the components I needed to purchase in order to have it fixed. However, they pretended that I was responsible for handling it and then continued as if nothing had occurred. It wasn't only exhausting, to be honest, it was becoming blatantly offensive. I didn't mind lending a hand occasionally, but this was constant, and they no longer even considered it a favor. They believed that I owed them anything. And remember, this was all still ongoing. In the meantime, they want that ridiculous $350 per week in rent. They seem to want me to do all the work and then get paid for it. I once calculated how many hours I spent working for them over the course of a week, between the repairs, the drives, and other general assistance tasks. In addition to my regular employment, I was easily putting in 10 to 15 hours a week just for them. To be honest, that would be a respectable side gig if I were getting paid for it. However, no. All of that time was just anticipated. Despite all of this, they never once offered to give me a reduction on the rent. They seemed to be attempting to get as much as they could from me before I realized and became impatient. Not that I hadn't made an effort to draw attention to anything I was doing. I had explained everything to them in the hopes that they would reconsider the absurd demand for rent. However, they dismissed it as though it didn't exist. They even dared to suggest that you might want to think about leaving if you don't like it. It seemed like they were taking advantage of me now. It seemed as though they were only looking for cash signals when they noticed that I had finally landed a well-paying job. They were unaware of all the things I had been doing for them for years and the hours I was already putting in. They were only concerned that I could afford to pay them $350 a week. So I should, in their thoughts. With all the work I was doing, I was essentially keeping the home together, but that didn't matter. All they wanted was the money. To be sure I wasn't exaggerating, I even discussed it with a few of my pals. When I explained everything to them, they all said, "Dude, that's crazy. They are completely exploiting you." If circumstances worsened, a few of them even offered to let me crash at their homes. Hearing that from someone else was strangely reassuring since, to be honest, I had begun to believe that I was the one who was being irrational, but they all agreed. When they're doing all the additional work I was doing, nobody pays that much for a shared room. I became increasingly aware that this was more than simply a rent issue as I gave it more attention. They seemed unappreciative of everything I did for them. They simply anticipated it, as though I were a live handyman and chauffeur together. They were trying to extract as much value as possible from the job I was doing rather than showing gratitude. The frustration of realizing that is difficult to describe. Don't get me wrong, I still loved my family, but it seemed like they were more interested in getting what they could from me than they were in me. They just regarded me as a labor and financial resource. They failed to see the time I was investing or the sacrifice I was making. They seemed to have forgotten that I was their child and not a cash ATM they could tap for free repairs or a few dollars whenever they wanted them. So yes, I was becoming rather tired. I knew something had to give because the whole thing was getting to me. I just did not yet know what that was. I eventually reached a point where I realized I had to take action after all the drama around the rent and me essentially serving as the unpaid assistants around the house. I couldn't continue to be treated with no gratitude, pressed for time and money. And although that may sound dramatic, I had just finished. I'm tired. The family had lost any authority at that moment, regardless of what they had done to persuade me to stay and assist. I simply couldn't stand this kind of treatment any longer. This is when my girlfriend enters the picture. She recently relocated to this little studio apartment near her university. It's comfortable, a bit small for two, but far better than having my own family treat me like a cash cow. She was also okay with my living with her. Furthermore, her house only cost $395 per month, including expenses. That amounted to maybe $30 more per person. When you're sharing it, that's almost nothing. It was also an absolute bargain when compared to what my parents wanted me to spend. Additionally, I was able to avoid the almost half-hour daily trip because her apartment was closer to my place of employment. Why am I even hesitating? I asked myself. This is much more logical. I wouldn't have to do all the housework like some underpaid butler, and I'd live closer to work, saving money. The choice was obvious, so I made up my mind. In February, I informed my parents that I was leaving. I gave them 2 months' notice because I wanted to be fair. They would have time to sort out whatever I was managing in this way. I was even upfront about the fact that when I moved out, I would no longer be doing repairs around the house, taking my siblings to school, or paying the bills. I believed that by alerting them, they would be more aware of the true impact I had on their lives. And what do you know? They seemed unfazed when I informed them, as though they just dismissed it as inconsequential. I wasn't playing games. I believe they believed I was bluffing, calling my hand or anything. After 2 months, I packed my belongings. Okay, maybe they'll understand it now, I thought. They could see I'm serious now. On the day of my move, I pack my car with necessities. My dad just replies, "We'll see you soon," while my mom hardly recognizes it at all. It was strange. They seemed to assume that I would turn around halfway down the road, as if I had missed it so badly that I had just run back. The problem is that I was prepared. I was eager to finish the entire process. I had already given them what I owed them. I felt a tremendous weight lift off my shoulders when I eventually moved my belongings into my girlfriend's flat. Man, I was free. I didn't feel compelled to do things only because they asked me to for the first time. It was a huge comfort. I will no longer have to get up early to drop my siblings off at school. No more doing haphazard home repairs. Paying for items I hardly used is over. No one was treating me like an ATM, and my partner and I were the only ones dividing the costs equally. This is when the exciting part begins. I noticed several missed calls and texts from my folks after about a week of living in. They kept coming one after another, as if they were growing more desperate, but I initially ignored them, thinking it was just them checking in. They kept sending us little messages like, "Hey, could you help us with this? Or will you be picking up your siblings to drop them off at school?" They genuinely believed that even after I moved out, I would continue to do all of that. They obviously still didn't understand, though I'm not sure if they assumed I would be dropping by daily or something. After a while, I answered my mother's phone to make amends. "Hey, when are you going to stop by and help with the bills?" she asked. It took me a moment to comprehend her question. Did she not recall, after all, that I had finished paying their bills? I informed her that I would no longer be covering her bills. I'm no longer living there. That's the main idea. I wasn't buying it when she tried to pull this guilt trick by saying things like, "Well, we relied on that help." I told her directly, "You have 2 months' notice from me. Perhaps it's time you learned how to manage without me if you're having trouble." They appeared to come to terms with reality after that call. Though I knew they would soon return with another request, I didn't hear anything for a while. They were unable to continue without attempting to get anything from me. I'm not sure. There was something curiously pleasant about being able to say no. It was the first time in years I'd put my foot down, and I didn't feel awful about it. I felt fantastic, honestly. Like for once, I was standing up for myself and not bending over myself to suit their expectations. The nicest aspect was just having time to myself again. I didn't know how much stress and time I'd wasted because of all I was doing for them. And it's not that I dislike my family or anything, but the way they just took me for granted, it made me understand that I needed to watch out for myself. No one else was going to do it for me, that's for sure. After a few days of ignoring additional missed calls and texts, I got one last text from my dad, and it just stated I thought we were family. And what do you know? For a moment, I was affected by that. Yes, we are family, therefore it hurt. However, when they treated me as a limitless source of money and labor, they weren't behaving that way. As I sat there, I wondered if the positions were reversed, they would do the same for me. To be honest, I didn't think they would. I thus didn't answer. I had had enough of the manipulation, the games, and the guilt trips. Now I had to live my own life. And I intended to make full use of it. People only begin to value what you do after you stop doing it, which is funny. Okay, so I've been living with my girlfriend and doing my own thing for a time now, away from my parents' house. To be honest, it's been wonderful to avoid their incessant requests. If it makes sense, my days have felt longer. For example, I now have this strange thing called free time when I'm not responsible for driving my siblings about, paying my bills, or doing sporadic maintenance. I'll be honest, too. I quickly adapted to it. However, my phone suddenly starts to blow up one day. I'm referring to several missed calls and texts from my mother. She usually doesn't blow up my phone like that unless there's an emergency, so I assumed it had to be something severe. When I do respond, she immediately starts to panic. The washing room apparently flooded. The floor was drenched by the washing machine's leak, and now the wall is beginning to collapse. She keeps talking about how she doesn't know what to do, and it's a complete disaster. I would have likely dropped everything and gone over if I were the old me. However, the new self was thinking that this was no longer my issue. I warned them that I wouldn't be their handyman forever and gave them 2 months' notice before I departed. It's not as if I suddenly stopped talking to them. My goals and everything I was dumping were crystal obvious. I inhale deeply and inform her that I am not available to come fix it. However, I'd be pleased to suggest some repairmen if you require assistance. You would think that I had advised her to set the house on fire or something. I can't believe you're simply leaving us like this, she says. Your dad's back problems prevent him from doing this type of work, you know. And, well, see, I understand. Even if my dad has a herniated disc, I'm not to blame for their lack of preparation. They simply thought I would always be available to solve things for nothing. I then inform her that I no longer reside there. I'm happy to come out and take care of it if that's what you want. However, I now charge $27 per hour, and to be kind. Because of this, I even give a $17 hourly discount. Family, hello. I had the option of going all out and making them feel it. However, I felt that was quite giving. I have the expertise, but I'm not a professional repair service. Furthermore, considering what they would need done, $17 per hour is a great deal. At that point, she loses it totally. Screaming over the phone, she accuses me of being ungrateful and selfish and claims that I owe them for everything they have done for me. After everything we gave up, she even tosses in, "How do you pay us back?" And that triggered a reaction. I won't lie. Despite all they gave up, I was driving my siblings, fixing things, and paying the bills. They now consider themselves saints for allowing me to reside in a room with my brother for $350 a week. I told her straight up, "You see, I owe you nothing. I've been assisting for years, completing all of your requests without hesitation. Additionally, you wanted to charge me more than I would for a private residence. I was clearly not a member of the family, as you stated. When you made me an on-call handyman and a walking ATM, she simply stopped talking, presumably surprised that I had said it. I assumed that was the end of it after this awkward, protracted wait. She then resumes, stating that they are in a difficult situation. My father is unable to work. It's tight on money, etc. And I understand. Everyone's life is difficult at the moment. However, that doesn't mean I'm responsible for it. I didn't put them in that predicament. I work full-time to pay my expenses and save a little money, but I'm barely making ends meet on my own. You know, they might have chosen differently. I apologized for her difficulties, but I informed her that she had two choices: either take care of it yourself or get someone to fix it. She simply persisted in pressing, attempting to make me feel guilty. "How can you be so callous?" I ask. "We are related." But it's not about being cold, in my opinion. It has to do with limits. I retaliated when they pushed, and now they have to face the consequences. In fact, I began to feel a bit awful at one point during the call. For example, my mother was obviously in need of assistance. However, I couldn't simply give in, or they would keep doing this nonsense repeatedly. They needed to understand that I would no longer be their doormat. For years, I had devoted my time, money, and energy to them, but it was never enough. Each time I offered assistance, they simply demanded more. She then plays a last card. "Your sister and brother miss you," she says. "They don't comprehend your refusal to assist us. They experience loneliness." Her voice cracked a little, which confused me. She seemed to be attempting to strike me in the tender spot. To be honest, it was effective for a little moment. I do have feelings for my siblings. I wasn't put in this predicament by them. However, I was also aware that my parents would just use them as leverage whenever they needed something if I gave in now. After taking a big breath, I assured her that I was always there to help my brother and sister. However, I can't continue to put myself last, only to ensure your comfort. You desired for me to reach adulthood. You assume adult duties and pay adult rent. This is me establishing limits as an adult. Then she simply hung up. "No, farewell, no. We will work things out. Complete quiet." As I sat there looking at my phone, I experienced a strange sense of relief mixed with shame and rage. I felt as though I had at last advocated for myself. And it felt right, even if it felt awful. Both my parents continued to text me after that. I ignored all of them, even though some were furious and others were experiencing guilt. I was aware that they would just attempt to wear me down once more if I opened the door. I decided to leave things alone, let them solve it. In retrospect, I can understand how they probably never imagined that I would truly move out. I'd always been the one to help out and preserve the peace, so they never imagined I'd quit doing things for them. But you know, people can only take so much. The last patch. Alright, so here I am, feeling fairly good about my life, and I'm situated in my new house with my girlfriend. It should come as no surprise that my folks continue to flood my phone with guilt, strange texts, missed calls, and other such nonsense. I'm ignoring it, though. I'm not going to go back and repair every little thing they can't manage because I've moved on. Then one day I received this SMS from my mother, and to be honest, I about burst out laughing. She keeps talking about how the house is falling apart without me, and how they are finding it difficult to keep up with all the repairs and upkeep. She also mentioned that my dad's back is worse than ever, and that they are in dire need of assistance. It appears like the sink is flowing profusely, the gutters are blocked, and the roof is leaking. Even the toilet is having some issues. My mother may have been in a panic over the rising water bill or something. Once upon a time, I would have packed my tool bag and gone straight over there. All I could think of now, though, was that perhaps they ought to have considered this before attempting to charge me $350 per week to share a bedroom with my brother. I just replied back, "Look, I'll even give you the family discount again and drop it to $17. You know my rate is $27 an hour." That's the agreement, though, if you want me to come repair things. In response, she sent a lengthy statement arguing that families shouldn't be required to compensate one another. And this is how you pay us back for everything we've done for you. I didn't even read it all the way through. She was standing there being theatrical, as if I had somehow betrayed them by not coming to them every time anything broke. It's interesting how they assumed they could treat me like a hired hand and then abruptly change the subject to discuss family loyalty whenever it's convenient for them. Regardless, I choose to disregard it. I felt okay about sticking to my guns, since I assumed they would either call an expert or figure it out on their own. However, my sister calls a few days later. She's weeping as she tells me that she and my brother are unhappy since my parents are often complaining about how I left them to do everything by themselves. She claims that the entire home is collapsing and that they must now ride the bus everywhere. She simply wants things to return to normal. That really got to me. The fact that my parents are so entitled is not my siblings' fault. They simply find themselves in the midst of it, and I understand. I apologized to my sister for requesting all of this. However, I informed her that I was no longer in charge of this. I would be miserable doing everything for free, while my parents took advantage of me if I didn't take care of myself. She made an effort to disagree, but I believe she realized it was pointless. I told her that she and my brother may call me at any moment if they needed anything. However, I just couldn't be the person my parents turned to for every minor issue they didn't want to deal with. Indeed, it was awful. For everyone, though, it also seemed like a required reality check. My mother texted me again about a week later. It was a lot shorter than that. "We're employing someone to do the repairs," she essentially stated. "We'll get by without you, so don't worry." And I couldn't help but feel a little relieved, even though I knew it was supposed to be some sort of guilt trip. It seemed as though they were finally coming to terms with the fact that I wouldn't be returning to save the day each time anything went wrong. My sister then informed me that they had actually employed someone to execute all of the tasks I had previously performed. And you know what? They were apparently taken aback by the whole expense. They had never bothered to do it themselves while I was there, so they had to pay for the roof, mend the gutter, clean the plumbing, and all the other miscellaneous things that had accumulated. It wasn't inexpensive, and the mounting expenditures were making my parents anxious. It was rather fulfilling. I won't lie. They were wanting $350 a week from me while pretending as though it was nothing. They eventually saw the value of all that labor, though, when they were forced to pay true experts for the same tasks. The problem is that if they had shown me any respect instead of treating me like a living handyman who owed them everything, I probably would have completed the task much more affordably. The finest aspect? A few days later, I received a message from my dad that said something like, "We're beginning to realize just how much you did around here. We didn't intend to give you the impression that we were exploiting you. It was one of those traditional excuses that don't involve an apology." They were obviously feeling the heat, though. They were paying the price even though they didn't think they would ever need me, literally. So yes, I did learn a lot from this. People occasionally don't realize how much you're helping them until they have to pay someone else to do it for them. They simply thought that I would continue to do everything for free indefinitely. And when I didn't, they had to confront the fact that I was truly making a difference. Though I believe they're now understanding, it's a difficult pill to take. It has been silent ever since. Even while my parents still occasionally text me, it's not the same as it used to be. No more pleading for assistance or guilt trips. Only sporadic messages, generally regarding weird topics. Even though they may not like it, I believe they're beginning to accept my limits now that they know I won't be returning to serve as their unpaid handyman. In retrospect, I'm happy I defended myself. It wasn't simple. Yes, I did occasionally feel sorry for my siblings in particular, but if I simply continued going above and beyond, it was essential. I would have been trapped in this never-ending loop of duty and hatred if they had continued to take me for granted. Thus, the lesson was learned. Avoid biting the hand that fixes your broken plumbing, clogged gutters, and leaking roof. People sometimes don't appreciate what they have until it's gone. To be honest, I don't mind at all. Story 3. I had enough, which is why this narrative is called Kicked Out My Wife and Her Daughter. I wanted to introduce you to my new channel before we go into today's video. It has a new look and shorter videos. Make sure to click the link in the description to check it out. Okay, let's start watching the video. OP states in the outset, yes, I am a 32-year-old man who has been married to Andy for a year. I found her to be just amazing. I am not joking when I say that she is 34. I honestly believed I had been lucky until all of this began. We got together, got along great, and proceeded slowly, primarily due to her daughter Carrie. Carrie was around 14 when I met her, but she is now 16. Furthermore, I could tell immediately that she wasn't happy to see me, which is fair enough, all right. Andy had been essentially a single mother ever since her father died in a car accident 5 years prior. So yes, I was aware that selling her child would be difficult. I made it clear to Andy right on that I didn't want to go too far or pretend to be Carrie's father or anything. I reasoned that I didn't want to replace anyone. All I wanted was for everything to proceed as smoothly as possible. Until we were certain that this relationship was a good one, Andy and I made the decision to keep me completely hidden from Carrie. Unless there was a significant issue between us, there was no use in worrying her. After some time, we finally reached that stage. Then came the moment I finally met Carrie. You know, I was going in with an open mind, hoping that she would at least be cool with me simply hanging around, but I would be lying if I said I wasn't anxious. That meeting was really uncomfortable. Carrie simply looked at me like if I had come to rob the TV or something. Hardly spoke to me at all. I avoided making eye contact at all costs, and she wasn't even tactful about it. Every time I spoke, she would roll her eyes and make these looks, like if she didn't care. See, I understand. She most likely thought I was some guy attempting to take over or that her mom was moving on too quickly. Furthermore, I had no intention of trying to take her father's place. I didn't want to give her the impression that I was pressuring her into a relationship. I also made sure she was aware of that. I advised her to simply address me by my first name. I didn't need to be referred to as stepdad or anything. I thought, yeah, okay, maybe she'll come around if I don't push it. When Andy advised me to give it some time. So I gave it a go. I ask her if she wants to go get dinner or whatever, or I do small things like asking her to join us. Informal. Nothing was ever forced. I would just back off if she wasn't feeling it. However, each time I attempted to interact, it seemed as though she would either ignore me completely, dig my way, toss a little, or mutter something under her breath. I would say something like, "Hey Carrie, would you like to join us at this new burger place?" And with that tone, she would simply answer, "No thanks," looking right through me, as if asking was a waste of her time, you know. She really laughed when I once offered that we go watch a movie she was interested in. "Oh, I don't believe you'd understand," she said. This sneer. Well, it's a teenage thing, all right. Perhaps, but she didn't seem to be making an effort. "She'll warm up," Andy would constantly assure me. "Give her some time." However, there are moments when I wonder how much time I have left. The awkwardness persisted. I would get glances that made me wonder if Carrie was thawing out a little, as if she might sometimes respond to a question without the customary sigh or eye roll. However, every time I believed we were making progress, we had to start over. For example, we all went to Andy's parents' house for a family gathering one weekend. All right, neutral territory, I thought. Perhaps things will run more smoothly. Not at all. Carrie made a big show out of sitting as far away from me as she could at every meal and ignored me the whole time. She believed I was sitting too near at one point, so she really got up and moved chairs. I would attempt to discuss it with Andy, simply to see if there was anything I could do better or if there was something I was missing. And Andy always said to leave her alone. She's gone through a lot, including losing her father. She will change her mind. I could see where she was coming from, but I felt like I was expected to be silent and simply accept it. And perhaps I ought to have, I'm not sure. I kept telling myself that things will improve, but they didn't. I eventually began to feel like a visitor in my own relationship. I didn't belong there, as if Carrie didn't want me there. I couldn't stop wondering if we would ever be able to have a meaningful conversation without her yelling at me or brushing me off. Despite Andy's constant attempts to mediate the conflict, I felt that she was caught in the midst and that she shouldn't have to pick between us. I get how this sounds now. Hey, it's just adolescent things, others could argue. However, this wasn't typical, it was intimate. I'd get home, attempt to lead a typical day, and then Carrie is making fun of me or engaging in subtle aggression. I felt like I was treading carefully in my own home because of the intense tension, and any small effort to improve the situation seemed to be failing. How can you even handle it, really? I had no desire to engage in combat with a 16-year-old. All I wanted was for everything to be all right. In hindsight, perhaps I ought to have attempted something else. However, what? I had no intention of kissing her or pleading with her to like me. Here, I wasn't the adversary, just a guy attempting to be her mother's excellent spouse. She continued to treat me like trash despite the fact that I understood her dad's passing was a great loss. I made an effort to be the mature one and ignore her remarks and demeanor, figuring that perhaps she would change her ways. To be honest, though, I was becoming tired. To what extent was I expected to take her? I was left waiting for this invisible, better time to arrive, even though Andy insisted she would get better. It felt like another slap in the face every time Carrie ignored me or dropped one of her attitude grenades, as if I was already unworthy of being in their lives. I had persuaded myself that things would improve after we all moved in together. That perhaps she would start to see me as more than just her mother's obnoxious new husband and feel more at home. I assumed it would just be an adjustment period because I had never lived with a teenager before. I hoped to learn more about her, perhaps even get close. As crazy as that sounds right now. However, I might have reconsidered taking Andy seriously at all if I had known what was going to happen. A whole new level of chaos began when they moved in, and as much as I hoped Carrie would change her mind, in actuality, I was plunging headfirst into an uncontrollable situation. I was going to have a rude awakening, man. In the end, we made the decision to move in together. Sincerely, I thought perhaps Carrie simply needed more time with me. Perhaps living together would help her and her mom break down the barriers that had kept her feeling like a stranger in their relationship. I hoped that Carrie would finally realize that I wasn't the enemy and that we would all have a significant family bonding experience. But was I mistaken? It seemed as though Carrie flicked a switch and changed her demeanor from aloof and unfriendly to outright animosity the moment they moved into my house. I'm referring about destroying my belongings, ignoring me, and just acting as like I'm an intruder in my own home. She would disregard me so severely that I would have to confirm that I was in the same room with her. She seemed to view me as a threat that needed to be repelled at every opportunity. I initially assumed it was just a typical teenage behavior, such as leaving her dishes heaped in the sink. I'd simply tidy them up and go on because, picking fights and all that. But things escalated swiftly. I started seeing minor acts of defiance, tiny mistakes left around simply to piss me off, towels tossed on the bathroom floor, garbage not carried out, random stuff like that. I'd mentioned it to Andy thinking she'd recognize what was going on, but she'd simply brush it off with, well, it's just a phase. She'll grow out of it. Then one day, I get home from work and walk into the kitchen, and there's glass all over the freaking floor. I mean, pieces of glass everywhere. As if an entire set of cups and plates had been broken. I began cleaning things up because I thought maybe she had dropped something by mistake. However, I then saw that some of the pieces appeared to have been purposefully damaged. I am referring to clean breaks, the type you get when someone throws things as forcefully as they can. When I questioned Andy about it, she appeared anxious but made an effort to hide it by responding, "Oh, she's just frustrated. I will speak with her, and I feel a sense of frustration." What the heck? Now she simply goes into full-blown devastation mode. However, I remained silent and let her handle it, wishing that perhaps her mother's advice might be beneficial. No, it didn't, quote, Carrie simply doubled down, if anything. She began focusing on the little things, and it seemed like she was always coming up with new ways to ruin my life. On the coffee table, she would leave half-empty soda cans turned over, causing the drink to flow everywhere, and then she would leave it there for me to discover. Or, while glaring at me and asking, "What are you going to do about it?" She would throw a whole bag of chips on the couch and simply leave the crumbs smashed into the fabric. I attempted to explain to Andy that this wasn't typical. She is deliberately being impolite. However, Andy would simply sigh and tell me that she was having a difficult moment. Simply exercise patience. It was becoming more and more difficult to be patient. I'll confess that I can get a little angry, but I was really trying to keep my anger in check for Andy's benefit. I didn't want to be the irate stepfather or anything like that. I attempt to ignore it and take deep breaths. Despite the fact that I was always unaware of the latest catastrophe Carrie had created when I returned home. Then the big one arrived. This is the day I finally lost it, and I will always remember it. After a hard day, I had just returned home when I noticed this terrible stench, as if something had perished within. After sniffing about, I finally figure out that the refrigerator is the cause. When I open it, I see raw chicken on the top shelf. It's not even wrapped, just sitting there. Because of the overpowering stink, it had been kept there for an unknown amount of time. As it happened, Carrie had removed the chicken in order to prepare the lunch. I just left it at her words, not mine, as if she was too lazy to tidy up. I asked her what the devil was going on and called her down while maintaining a calm tone of voice. "I forget," she simply shrugged. That was all she said. "Don't apologize." Nothing. In the end, I cleaned it myself while complaining to myself and trying not to lose my cool. However, she exceeded even that a few days later. A number of my tools are laying around in the garage, smeared in muck when I go in to retrieve something. Carrie chose to treat my belongings like a playground because she had been playing around in there. "Why are my tools covered in mud?" I questioned her. She said, "I need them," with a deadpan expression on her face. What the heck? At last, I lost it. Probably loudly than I should have, I shouted, telling her to respect my belongings because this was my home. After hearing everything, Andy hurried in to attempt to mediate the situation and beg me not to make it worse. But I was finished then. "This cannot continue," I told Andy bluntly. "I'm tired of Carrie's nonsense." I didn't care at the time, but Andy appeared wounded. Carrie was treating me like crap, and I wasn't going to put up with it any longer. I'd been trying to be patient and be the good guy. I simply chuckled and replied, "Yeah, maybe this time it'll actually work," after Andy assured me once more that she would speak with Carrie. However, Carrie did her most absurd prank to date the next day. She had gone into my office and removed all of my computer wires when I woke up, since it took me 30 minutes to reinstall everything. It dawned on me then that I was dealing with a child who truly didn't care about anyone but herself. This wasn't a period of adolescence. A child who believed she could get away with anything at this time had a complete meltdown. It felt like she was attacking me personally with everything she did. I kept wondering what fresh mess Carrie had left for me to discover every time I entered a room. Andy would just respond, "She'll come around." Whenever I brought it up to her, simply give her room. I'd given it everything I had. Carrie was destroying my belongings and laughing it off while I was going crazy trying to hold it together. Before long, I would have reached my breaking point. In hindsight, I may have done something differently, but to be honest, I was tired of trying to maintain the peace all the time. I had had enough of feeling like I was only waiting for Carrie to give me some respect. In the back of my mind, I was beginning to wonder if living together was the worst thing I had ever done. That's where it all happened. The moment I'd had enough. For what seemed like an eternity, I had tolerated Carrie's clutter and attitude. I had hoped that things would improve soon, but it turned out that I was naive enough to believe that anything would change. There was no turning back from the route she went this time. It began as any other night would. Andy and I made the decision to eat supper together. Sincerely, I wanted a respite from the ongoing stress in the house, and we hadn't had a genuine date night in a long time. I hadn't seen anything positive from Carrie in months, despite Andy's constant insistence that I should see the positive in her. So yes, I was hoping for a few hours of tranquility. As soon as I exit the car as we pull into the driveway after supper, I see that the garage door is ajar. I'm a little nervous about that type of stuff, so I know now that I closed it as we left. Furthermore, it was already late at night, even if I hadn't. Instead of being in the garage, Carrie ought to have been inside. I'm already tense because I suspect something's wrong. My car is in the center of the garage as I enter, and I instantly freeze there, my excitement and pride. The BMW X5 is completely destroyed. I'm conversing with tires. The sides have deep scrapes, and the side mirror appears to be shattered. Even the hood has scuff marks as if someone had been walking on it. And who is that calm-looking person standing there with a kitchen knife in her hand? Carrie. My blood became icy. What I was seeing was unbelievable. She simply stood there and stared at me, wearing a smug little grin that suggested she was pleased with herself. I choked out. "What on earth are you doing, Carrie?" She simply shrugged, casual as if she had just committed a felony-level act of vandalism. She claims it's just an automobile. Just a vehicle. I went crazy. For the sake of Andy, I'd been keeping quiet for months, putting up with all of her petty antics. However, this was more than I could have ever dreamed. I ordered her to get out of my sight and basically labeled her a spoilt little brat. I should have known better than to shout, but what else could I have done? For amusement, she just wrecked my automobile. Andy, who most likely heard the shouting, runs into the garage at this moment. After giving the automobile a quick glance, she turns to me calmly and says, "It's not as bad as it looks," rather than criticizing Carrie. She's simply misbehaving. Don't shout to make things worse. It seemed unbelievable to me, I quote, looking at my automobile while I stand there. In front of us, there is damage worth thousands of dollars. She also advises me not to exacerbate the situation. I stared at Andy, unable to speak. How, after all, could she justify this? "This isn't acting out," I informed her. "This is illegal activity. She must take responsibility for her actions." Andy, however, was unwilling to listen, saying that we should all calm down and that they would discuss it in the morning. She attempted to yank Carrie away. Not that I was cooling off, not after Carrie's actions. So I told Andy at that very moment, "You two are free to go if you find this acceptable, and don't mind Carrie damaging my belongings and treating me badly." Andy, quote, "S mouth fell open." She didn't think I would say that. "You don't mean that," she insisted again. "All you're feeling is anger." I wasn't just furious, though. I had had enough of being treated disrespectfully in my own house, done with Carrie's attitude and the incessant mess. I had had enough of being the villain while Carrie got away with everything. I threatened to sue Andy if she didn't pay for the damage. It may sound drastic, but I would have reached my breaking point. In the garage, I have cameras. It was all recorded. She was not going to get away with this. Andy's face became white, and she began to cry, accusing me of being cold-hearted and going too far. By claiming that Carrie was going through a lot and had been having difficulties since her father's death, she attempted to guilt-trip me. I understand. Even if losing a parent is terrible, it doesn't give you the right to destroy someone else's stuff and have no regrets about it. I apologized to her for Carrie's suffering, but this is too much. To maintain the peace. I won't pretend that this conduct is usual, since it isn't. We spent around 15 minutes going back and forth. I threatened to take Carrie to court if she didn't pay for the damage, and Andy said I was mean for even bringing up the idea. It seemed as though her devotion to Carrie had blinded her to the harm Carrie was doing, not only to my vehicle, but to our relationship as a whole. And to be honest, I knew right then that Andy would never see it. All along, I had been deluding myself into believing she would change her mind and defend me. Here, however, she was standing up for Carrie, even after the child had destroyed my car and cut my tires. Carrie was just standing there as I took one more glance at her. She had no guilt at all on her face. There was still that arrogant little sneer. She seemed to have won a game that I was unaware we were playing. I told them both at that point, "Leave now, gather your belongings and depart." They appeared as though they were in disbelief that I had truly followed through. Andy began pleading with me to relax, stating that we could resolve the issue, that Carrie didn't mean it. But at that moment, I didn't care. When it became clear that no one else was interested in making this work, I gave up attempting to make things better. I stood staring at the devastation of my automobile as they drove away. I've never felt so exhausted in my life. I'd been trying to make this family work for a year, enduring so much nonsense. I wanted a life with Andy because I loved her. But in the end, Carrie's behavior made it clear to me precisely where I stood. And Andy's response demonstrated it. I sat in the silence that night, wondering how in the world this had happened. I felt foolish for allowing it to go this long and for holding out hope that things would improve when they didn't, quote, T. dot. However, it was obvious that I was no longer going to allow Carrie or anybody else walk all over me. I had finally had enough, and this was the final straw. I sat in the quiet after they had gone, experiencing a strange mixture of relief and rage. I continued staring out the window, half expecting Andy to return, half expecting him to throw another fit, but nobody did, dot. The home was utterly silent for the first time in what seemed like forever. At that moment, I realized it was truly finished. I had been pushing and pulling to make things work for the entire year, putting forth extra effort to ensure everyone is satisfied. However, now that they were gone, I could at last experience serenity, dot. And to be honest, it was incredible. I returned to the garage to inspect my vehicle, taking in the tires, the dings, and the damage caused by Carrie. Everything was still there. I was annoyed to see that, but it also served as a reminder of why things had to stop. I told them to go, and I didn't feel bad about it. I felt this was the appropriate choice after everything Carrie had to go through and Andy's lack of concern, dot. There was no turning back. I slept better that night than I have in months. I didn't have to be concerned about my equipment being strewn all over the garage or walking on shattered glass in the kitchen. It was not necessary for me to enter a room and worry what sort of disaster Carrie had left behind. I felt truly at home in my own space for the first time. I began planning to move on the next morning. I was aware that I would need to handle the automobile problem, decide whether to replace or repair it, and maybe even file a police complaint if necessary. For the time being, though, all I wanted was to savor the silence and feel once more in charge of my life. Andy began sending me texts as the days passed. She was just checking in and asking if we could chat at first. She would write me lengthy texts expressing how much she missed me, how she believed we could resolve our differences, how Carrie's behavior was solely a result of her father's passing. She had been repeating the same things all along. To be honest, it only made me realize why I couldn't continue doing this. In an attempt to make it work, I had tried everything. And as Andy stood up for Carrie, she continued to press all of my buttons. Most of the texts were ignored by me. I was aware that responding would just result in another exchange of words in which she would attempt to persuade me to take them back. However, I had no curiosity. I had already made up my mind and was following it. Andy arrived at the residence a few days later. I suppose she chose to attempt face-to-face since I hadn't responded to her messages. She was there when I answered the door, looking very sorry and teary-eyed. She informed me of the difficulties she and Carrie had faced, the fact that Carrie was still dealing with the loss of her father, and her belief that I was giving up on them too quickly. I simply listened, but as she spoke, I became more and more aware that nothing had changed. She continued to defend Carrie, make excuses, and refuse to see my point of view. At last, I halted her and informed her, "Look, I've tolerated this for a year. I've done all in my power to keep this family together, and all I received was disarray and disdain." I quote, finished. She appeared hurt, but it was clear to me that she didn't really comprehend. "Carrie will change and we can work through this," she began to explain. However, I didn't believe it. "You have a year to help her comprehend," I told her. "She couldn't simply treat people badly and get away with it, she knew, and you did nothing. I can no longer live that way." She nodded and acknowledged understanding after a lengthy, uncomfortable silence. She probably recognized for the first time that I wasn't going to give up, and that I wasn't going to let Carrie walk all over me. I simply said her farewell and shut the door after she attempted to say a few more things. I refused to allow her to use guilt to influence my decision. After she left, I felt like a big burden had been lifted. I had been clinging to the notion that we were a contented little family. However, that was all a fiction I had created for myself. In actuality, everything was finally ended. I had been living in a nightmare. I began to reconstruct my life in the days that followed. I concentrated on organizing things, repairing the house, and restoring a sense of belonging. With each small action I took, I felt more like myself, and as like I was taking back my own space. Naturally, people began to ask questions. Family and friends were curious about what had transpired, why Carrie and Andy had left. I kept it easy. Simply informed them that things didn't work out. I was okay with no one really pressing for specifics. I didn't want to repeat all the minor things Carrie had done or explain why Andy hadn't supported me. I was happier, and those who knew me well could tell, and it was sufficient. However, there were times when I would reflect on everything and experience some melancholy, a hint of remorse, maybe. I devoted a lot of time and effort on something that ended up being a whole disaster, not because I missed them. I wanted to be Andy's supporting partner and have a family, but it hadn't worked out. However, I ultimately came to the conclusion that being content and alone was preferable to being confined to a poisonous environment where I was continuously treated disrespectfully. I eventually made the decision to get rid of certain items that made me think of Carrie and Andy as I was organizing the garage one day. I threw away some miscellaneous items they had left behind, including old clothing and notes. And I had the impression that I was making significant progress as I worked, as if I were permanently shutting that chapter of my life Andy wanted to communicate, so he contacted out after everything had happened. To be honest, I wasn't excited to see you, but I had hoped that there would be some type of resolution. Or perhaps she would at last see my point of view. After we sat down, she began to explain that I simply needed to have patience and that we could figure it out. She urged me to return and give it another go, expressing confidence that Carrie will recover. That this was only a difficult time. However, I was finished. I had been patient enough already. For a year, I had been giving chances as Carrie destroyed my belongings and my mental stability, and each time Andy allowed it to happen. As softly as possible, I informed her, "I apologize, but I'm finished. Andy, I can't continue like this." I clarified that I needed to take a moment to consider myself, and that this was a pattern of disrespect and mayhem rather than a single incident. To be honest, I could see she didn't get it completely. She honestly thought that if I simply tolerated Carrie's antics for a little while longer, things could be resolved. The problem is that I didn't want to tolerate it. I had had enough of waiting for a child who didn't respect me at all. I'm sick of Andy defending her all the time. I'm also sick of feeling alienated in my own house. Because of our prenuptial agreement and the fact that we did not share money, the divorce procedure was not messy, and we ultimately signed the papers very swiftly. In fact, it was rather easy. We just signed the documents after sitting down with them. There's no need to prolong it farther than we have already. It seemed unreal in several ways. For example, is this it? However, I felt in my heart that this was the proper course of action. The only evidence I needed was the relief I experienced. The automobile damage was still an issue, of course. Things became complicated at that point. Apparently, vandalism was not covered by my coverage, thus my insurance provider refused to pay for it. I was responsible for the entire €6,000 amount of damage. It was a gut punch to see that estimate, particularly in light of everything else that had transpired. I informed Andy up front that Carrie had to pay for the expenses and accept responsibility for her actions. She wasn't exactly in a position to contribute, and to her surprise, Andy didn't have the money. She was having trouble finding a place of her own after returning to live with her parents. Her hands were so bound. For a long time, I contemplated whether or not to let it go. Really, though, why should I? Carrie needed to understand that her actions had repercussions, and I was sick of always having to pick up the pieces. I so struck a bargain with Andy. I would pay for the repairs in advance, and she would reimburse me on a monthly basis until everything was resolved. To ensure that there would be no forgetting or retreating, we even had it formally documented. I wasn't going to let it happen by accident. Additionally, Carrie now has a criminal record as a result of my filing a police report. I'm aware that some people may find it excessive, but you would understand if you had been in my position. This is something she caused herself. Perhaps she had come to the realization that she couldn't simply destroy people's possessions and hope for nothing in return. The ensuing weeks were intriguing. At first, I'll confess, it was odd, returning home to a clean, clutter-free home free of the attitude and disarray that awaited me. It took me a little bit to adjust to the silence since I had been so accustomed to the strain. Strangely enough, though, I began to feel much lighter after the first several days. I felt as though a huge burden had been removed from my shoulders. I didn't have to be concerned about my equipment being strewn all over the garage or walking on shattered glass in the kitchen. In months, for the first time. In fact, I felt calm. During all of this, friends have been fantastic. They were all on my side once I informed a couple of them what had transpired. They said that I needed to advocate for myself and that I had done the right thing. That was encouraging to hear since, to be honest, there were times when I questioned whether I had made the correct decision. You don't kick out your wife and stepdaughter every day, after all. But any concerns would go as soon as I reminded myself of what I had endured. I had been understanding, patient, and going above and beyond to maintain harmony for a whole year. And where have I ended up? My car was wrecked, and my stepdaughter was rude to me. No comma. I had no regrets about my choice. Thank you to everyone present who assured me that I wasn't the jerk. Although it may sound corny, your remarks were really quite beneficial. It's strange to consider, yet sometimes it's simpler to gain insight from strangers than from those who know you well. I'm reading your comments and the affirmations that you're not the villain. It was just what I needed to continue on my path. Andy would occasionally send me an SMS, just brief notes to check in and see how I was doing. Nothing too serious. Most of them I disregarded. Rehashing anything or becoming guilt-tripped into doubting myself was not something I was interested in. When she repeatedly sided with Carrie, she had made her decision, and I had made mine. Besides, comma, I didn't need to be dragged back into that situation. I'm concentrating on putting my life back on track now that everything is behind me. I began working on small chores about the house, arranging and repairing items to give it a sense of belonging again. Everything feels so much different now that I don't have to worry about it. I'm getting back in touch with pals. For months I hadn't seen. Allowing time for pastimes I would give up. For once, I am taking care of myself. Indeed, it feels really nice. It has been an extremely difficult few weeks. Ultimately, though, I feel lighter. I feel liberated. My tranquility, my personal space, and my sanity have all returned. And it is more valuable than any benefit I might have had from remaining. Let go on with life. I also want to thank everyone who reminded me that I wasn't the bad guy in this situation.